What would you do if the whole town told you the place you'd just bought was cursed, and the deed in your hand was worth less than the paper it was printed on? For Eliza Hart, 19 years old, orphaned in the spring and cast out by summer, this wasn't a question. It was the reality she faced when the stagecoach let her off at the edge of a settlement called Bell's Hollow, Colorado, with $14 in her pocket and the keys to a schoolhouse nobody had opened in 11 years. The townsfolk called it the ghost school. They said the bell hadn't rung since the winter the teacher walked into the snow and never came back. They said the roof leaked, the well was dry, and the children who'd once sat at those desks had grown up and moved away. But beneath the floorboards of that abandoned schoolhouse, sealed inside a room nobody in Bell's Hollow knew existed, was a secret that had been waiting 11 long years for the right pair of hands to find it, a secret that would rewrite the story of a dead man, save a dying town, and give a girl with $14 a legacy worth more than gold. Settle in, friends, pour yourself something warm, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Eliza Hart was born in a two-room carpenter's house on the edge of Fort Collins in the autumn of 1886, and the first sound she remembered clearly was the sound of her father's plane peeling a curl of pine from a board. Silas Hart was a joiner by trade, a maker of doors and window frames and, when the season was slow, coffins. He was a tall, patient man with hands like weathered oak, and he taught his only daughter the way another father might teach a son, because Eliza's mother had died of the fever when the girl was 4, and Silas had no one else to pass his knowledge to. By the time Eliza was 7, she could name every tool in the shop and hand it to him without being asked. By 10, she could dovetail a drawer joint tight enough that no light showed through the seam. By 14, she was building window sashes on her own and selling them to a builder in town for $1 apiece. Her father taught her the language of the craft the way a preacher teaches scripture. He spoke of grain and figure, of quarter-sawn oak and heart pine, of the difference between a rip-cut and a cross-cut, of how a tenon must be a hair proud of its mortise so the joint would draw tight when pegged. He taught her that wood remembers, that a board cut in a wet season will move for years, that a door hung on a green frame will bind by August, that a house built without patience will speak its complaints in creaks and cracks for a century. And he taught her to listen. A carpenter who can't hear the wood, he said once, tapping a plank with his knuckle to test for hollows and rot, is only a man who breaks things quickly. On the morning of her 12th birthday, Silas gave her a small tool he'd carried since his own apprenticeship, a folding brass rule, 6 inches long, hinged in the middle, with the maker's stamp W. Rabone, Sheffield pressed into the metal. It was scarred and dented, but the numbers were still crisp, and the hinge still moved smooth as a whisper. A carpenter without a rule, he said, closing her fingers around it, is a carpenter without a conscience. Keep it on you. Measure twice. And when you doubt yourself, girl, measure a 3rd time. Eliza kept that brass rule in the small pocket of her apron every day for the next 7 years, and she would carry it into every room, every wilderness, every hard-won hour of the story that follows. Silas Hart died in the March of 1905, coughing blood into a rag in the corner of the shop he had built himself. He was 51 years old. The doctor called it consumption. Eliza called it the end of the only home she had ever known. She was 18. And within a month of the funeral, the shop, the tools, the house, and the small strip of land they stood on all passed by law to her only remaining kin, her father's older brother, a bank clerk in Denver named Cornelius Hart. Cornelius Hart was not a cruel man in the way villains in penny novels are cruel. He did not shout. He did not strike. He kept his fingernails trimmed and his ledger books immaculate, and he spoke to his niece in the same measured, cordial tone he used with delinquent borrowers. He arrived in Fort Collins 2 weeks after the burial, wearing a black wool suit and carrying a leather portfolio, and within an hour of stepping into his brother's shop he had inventoried every plane, every chisel, every board of seasoned walnut leaning against the wall, and had assigned each a number in a small green notebook. Eliza was moved, without discussion, to a narrow attic room in his Denver townhouse, where she was expected to help his wife with the laundry and the mending and to keep her opinions to herself at supper. The shop in Fort Collins was sold. The tools were sold. The walnut boards were sold. Only her father's brass rule survived, because Eliza had it in her apron pocket the day the auctioneer's men came, and Cornelius, glancing at the small brass object and finding no resale value in it, had waved it off with a small shake of his head. She lived in that attic for 11 months. She did not argue. She did not weep at the supper table. She mended shirts, boiled sheets, scrubbed the front steps twice a week, and in the evenings, by the light of a single tallow candle, she read her father's old carpentry manuals from a small trunk she had smuggled up the back stairs. She said very little. She measured everything. And then, on a cold February morning in 1906, Cornelius called her into his study, closed the door, and sat her down across from a walnut desk on which lay a single sheet of paper and a small stack of banknotes. He did not offer her tea. He opened the green notebook to a page marked Hart, Eliza, account, and turned it so she could read the sum at the bottom. $14. He explained, in the cordial voice of a man reading a foreclosure notice, that after the costs of the funeral, the freight on the tools, the auctioneer's commission, her room and board for the past year, and the small fee he was owed for administering his brother's estate, this was the balance remaining to her. He slid the $14 across the desk. Then he slid a second document, a deed, on top of it. There is also, he said, tapping the deed with one manicured finger, this. It was in your father's papers. A property he seems to have taken as payment for a job some years ago and never disposed of. A schoolhouse in a place called Bell's Hollow, in the mountains west of here. The town, I am told, is largely abandoned. The building is worthless. But it is legally yours, and it is not, technically, my responsibility to sell it for you. I have arranged a stage ticket. You will leave on Thursday. He closed the notebook. I wish you well, Eliza. She did not argue. She took the $14. She took the deed. She stood, thanked him in a voice so even it might have been sanded smooth, and went upstairs to pack. Her bag, when she carried it down 2 days later, contained one wool dress, one linen shift, one pair of stout boots, her mother's silver locket, her father's 2 remaining carpentry manuals, a small folding knife, a tin of matches, and, in the bottom of the bag wrapped in a scrap of oiled cloth, the brass rule stamped W. Rabboni, Sheffield. The stage left Denver at dawn on Thursday, February 22, 1906. It carried 3 passengers, 4 sacks of mail, and a crate of nails bound for a hardware store in a town called Idaho Springs. The road climbed westward out of the plains into foothills stubbled with pine, and by mid-morning the horses were laboring, their breath rising in white plumes against a sky the color of hammered pewter. Eliza sat by the window and watched the landscape change, the tidy fenced fields of the plains giving way to broken ground and creek gullies, then to the first serious rise of the Front Range, granite bones pushing through thin skin of soil. They changed horses at Idaho Springs, and then at Georgetown, and then began the long, brutal switchback climb over Loveland Pass. By the afternoon of the second day, snow lay 6 inches deep on the road, and the driver, a bearded man named Halloran who chewed tobacco and spoke rarely, had wrapped a length of blanket around Eliza's feet without a word when he saw her shivering. They descended into a long, narrow valley of the Blue River, and at last, on the third morning, the coach pulled up in front of a low, weathered building with a hand-painted sign that read simply, Bell's Hollow, Postal Agent and DRY Goods. Halloran climbed down, opened her door, and set her bag in the snow. He looked at the deed she held in her mittened hand, and then he looked at the ridge above the town, where a single tall gable rose above a stand of leafless aspens. That the school? He asked. So the deed says. He spat a brown stream into the snow and considered her for a long moment. Miss, he said, I have driven this road 22 years. I knew the man who built that schoolhouse. I knew the teacher who kept it. I would not spend a night in that building for $100 in coin. There's men in this town would give you $5 for the deed just to see it burned. Take the $5. Ride back with me tomorrow. Eliza folded the deed carefully and put it inside her coat. Thank you, she said. I'll walk up and see it first. Halloran nodded once, as though he had expected exactly that answer, and climbed back onto the box. The walk from the postal agent's door to the schoolhouse was a quarter-mile, uphill, through snow that came to her knees in places. Bell's Hollow, she saw as she climbed, was a town in the slow act of dying. There had once been perhaps 40 buildings along the single main street, now half of them stood empty, their windows boarded, their doors sagging. A stamp mill on the far hillside had rusted into its own foundations. The Blue River, iron-gray and half-frozen, ran through the valley bottom, and along its banks she could see the abandoned sluice boxes and tailings piles of a silver rush that had come and gone before she was born. The schoolhouse sat on a shelf of level ground above the town, backed against a stand of aspen and pine. It was a solid, rectangular building of squared logs on a fieldstone foundation, with a shingled roof and a small square belfry rising from the front gable. The bell was still there. The rope was gone. The front door was padlocked with an iron lock so rusted that Eliza, after a moment's inspection, took her father's small folding knife from her bag, worked the pin out of the hinge, and simply lifted the door aside. Inside, the air was cold and still and smelled of mice and old wood smoke. 12 desks stood in 3 neat rows, each with a slate resting on its top as though the children had only just stepped out for recess. A cast-iron stove squatted in the middle of the room. At the front, a chalkboard still bore the faint ghost of a lesson in cursive, the words "Be kind. Be honest. Be brave," written in a woman's careful hand and never erased. Behind the teacher's desk, a small door led to what had been the teacher's living quarters, a single room with a bunk, a washstand, a small stove, and an empty wardrobe standing open. Eliza stood in the middle of the classroom for a long time. She did not weep. She took the brass rule from her apron pocket, unfolded it, and, out of some instinct she could not have explained, measured the width of the room. 24 feet, exact. She measured the length. 32 feet, exact. She measured the height of the ceiling from a chair. 9 feet, 6 inches. The numbers steadied her. Numbers always had. That night she slept on the teacher's bunk under her wool coat and 2 horse blankets she had bought from the postal agent for $1. She woke in the blue dark before dawn to the sound of her own breath crystallizing on the air, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "I am 19 years old, I have $13 left, and this is my house." She began work at first light. The first week she did nothing but clean and repair. She swept 11 years of mouse leavings and pine needles from the floor. She reset 3 broken window panes with putty she mixed herself from linseed oil and whiting she bought at the dry goods for 11 cents. She cut and split enough deadfall aspen to feed the stove for a month. She patched the roof where a shingle had lifted, climbing the ladder with her father's brass rule in her pocket and measuring each new shake against the old. Her hands, which had grown soft in Cornelius's attic, cracked and bled and calloused again into the hand she remembered. On the 5th day, an old man in a wolfskin coat stopped at the schoolhouse door and stood watching her drive nails. He was perhaps 70, small, wiry, with a beard the color of wood ash and eyes like chips of blue river ice. He said his name was Ansel Crow. He said he had trapped these mountains since before the silver rush, and he had known the man who built this school, and he had known the teacher who kept it. He watched her work for a long minute without speaking. Then he said, in a voice like dry leaves, "The bell has been waiting on you, girl." He measured this whole place twice, but there was one measure he never got to finish. She looked up from her hammering. Who did? Ansel Crow only touched the brim of his hat and walked back down the hill without answering. She would think about that sentence. He measured this whole place twice, but there was one measure he never got to finish, for many nights afterward, and she would not understand it for another 3 weeks. By the 2nd week, word had spread through Bell's Hollow that the Hart girl was staying. A man named Josiah Pell, who owned the stamp mill ruins and half the empty storefronts on the main street, walked up the hill on a Tuesday afternoon in a fine grey overcoat and offered her $25, cash in hand, for the deed. He said he was doing her a kindness. He said the building would fall in on her by spring. He said a girl her age had no business alone in a mountain town, and he had a cousin in Denver who was hiring housemaids. Eliza thanked him for his concern, folded her hands in her apron, and told him the schoolhouse was not for sale. Josiah Pell's smile did not reach his eyes when he left. He was the 2nd person in a week to try to buy the deed off her, and Eliza, who had lived a year in the house of a man who spoke in ledgers, understood exactly what that meant. Something in this building was worth more than $25, and Josiah Pell suspected it. The low point came in the 3rd week. A blizzard closed the pass for 4 days. The stove smoked. A section of the roof she had thought sound gave way under the weight of new snow and dropped a wet slab of shingle and rotten batten onto the teacher's bunk in the middle of the night. She spent that night in the classroom by the stove, wrapped in every blanket she owned, and for the first time since her father's funeral she allowed herself to cry, not loud, not long, but honest. When she woke at dawn, her face stiff with dried tears, she thought, I could sell. I could take $25 and go. And then she thought of the brass rule in her apron pocket, and her father's voice saying measure a 3rd time, and she got up and put the kettle on. That morning she began to tear out the collapsed section of the ceiling, and that was when she found the first clue. She was standing on a chair with a pry bar, working loose the water-damaged planks of the ceiling above the teacher's bunk, when a length of board came free in her hands and she saw, in the exposed joist above, a mark she had not expected. It was a carpenter's mark, 3 notches cut into the side of the joist, in a triangular pattern, exactly the pattern her father had taught her to use when he wanted to remember which piece went where in a complex frame. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she climbed down, went to the classroom, and looked up at the ceiling there. The classroom ceiling was original. It had not been disturbed in years. But when she pulled a chair beneath the beam that ran the length of the room and looked up, she saw, faint but unmistakable, the same 3-notch mark on the underside of the beam, and beside it, cut with the same hand, a set of numbers. 24, 32, 9 to 6, 24, 32, 9 feet, 6 inches. The exact measurements of the classroom. Width, length, ceiling height. Except the numbers were wrong. She took the brass rule from her pocket, unfolded it, and measured again, more carefully than before. The classroom was 24 feet wide, 32 feet long, but from the outside, when she paced the foundation, the building was 38 feet long. She had assumed the extra 6 feet belonged to the teachers' quarters at the back. She had not measured the teachers' quarters. She measured them now. 5 feet, 4 inches deep. Which left, unaccounted for, somewhere in the structure of this building, a space almost 7 feet long and 24 feet wide that did not appear inside any room. She sat down on the classroom floor with the brass rule open across her knee, and she thought about Ansel Crow's words. He measured this whole place twice, but there was one measure he never got to finish. And she thought about her father saying would remembers, and about the 3-notch mark cut into a joist that no child was ever meant to see, and she understood, with a slow and rising certainty, that the man who had built this schoolhouse had built something else into it as well. What would you do, if you were 19 years old and alone in a mountain town, and you had just realized that the walls around you were hiding a room? Let us know in the comments what you'd do next. Would you dig, or would you sell? Eliza did not sell. Eliza measured. For 3 days she measured every wall, every floorboard, every panel of the schoolhouse, marking her findings in pencil on a sheet of butcher's paper spread across a desk. She worked with the methodical patience her father had drilled into her from the age of 7, and by the evening of the 3rd day she had narrowed the hidden space to a single location, behind the chalkboard at the front of the classroom. The chalkboard was a heavy slab of slate mounted on a wooden backing, and the backing, when she tapped it with her knuckles, gave a different sound in the center than it did at the edges. A hollow sound. A held breath sound. She spent that night sharpening her father's chisels, the 2 he had allowed her to keep, hidden inside the carpentry manuals that Cornelius had never thought to look for. In the morning she stoked the stove hot, warmed her hands until the blood came back into her fingers, and began to work the chalkboard free of the wall. It came away in one piece after 2 hours of patient prying. Behind it, set into the log wall, was a panel of tongue and groove pine, painted white to match the plaster, that had been fitted so carefully she would never have found it without the measurements. She ran the brass rule along its edges. 4 feet wide. 6 feet tall. A door. Not a door with hinges, a door built to be pried open once, by someone who knew where to look. She found the seam at the top with the tip of her smallest chisel. She worked it down the left side, then the right, tapping the mallet with the small, controlled strokes her father had taught her, the strokes of a joiner opening a case, not a laborer breaking a wall. The panel came loose in her hands after another hour. She set it aside. Cold, dry air breathed out of the opening, and with it a smell of old paper and pine resin and something faintly metallic. She lit a lantern and stepped through. The room behind the chalkboard was 6 feet, 10 inches deep, 23 feet, 8 inches wide, and floored with the same rough pine as the schoolroom. A single small window, high on the back wall and covered from the outside by the same shingles as the rest of the roof, let in a thin grey light. There was a workbench along one wall. There were shelves along the other. There was a narrow cot, still made, with a folded grey blanket at its foot. And there was, in the centre of the room, a heavy oak chest, banded with iron, its lid closed but unlocked. The shelves held books. Dozens of them, school books, primers, McGuffey readers, but also volumes of Shakespeare, a Latin grammar, a worn copy of Emerson's essays, and a leather-bound ledger. The workbench held a set of carpenter's tools laid out in careful order: planes, chisels, a small brace and bit, a saw, a folding brass rule almost identical to her father's but stamped Stanley, New Britain. The walls, she saw now, were hung with drawings, architectural sketches of the schoolhouse itself, plans for an addition that had never been built, and, in one corner, a pencil portrait of a woman with dark hair and a small boy in her lap. Beneath the portrait, someone had written in careful cursive, Mary and Thomas, 1893. Eliza knelt in front of the chest and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were 3 canvas bags of the sort banks used for coin. She lifted one. It was heavy. She untied the drawstring. Gold. Not dust, coin. United States double eagles, $20 pieces, stacked in paper rolls. She counted 1 roll. 20 coins. She counted the rolls in the first bag. 12 rolls. 240 coins. $4,800 in the one bag. She did not open the other 2. She did not need to. Beneath the canvas bags was a smaller wooden box, and beneath that, a sealed envelope of yellowed paper, addressed in the same careful cursive as the portrait, to whoever finds this. She sat down on the floor of the hidden room with the letter in her hands and her lantern beside her. For a long moment she did not open it. She thought of her father. She thought of Ansel Crow. She thought of the woman named Mary and the small boy named Thomas. Then she broke the seal. The letter was dated November 14, 1894. It read, "Asterisk to whoever finds this, and I pray it is someone patient and honest and in need asterisk. Asterisk my name is Elias Wheeler. I was the teacher of this school and the builder of this building. I put up these walls with my own hands in the summer of 1890, and I taught the children of Bell's Hollow in this room for 4 winters. I write this letter now because I do not know if I will see the spring, and I wish the truth to survive me. Asterisk. Asterisk the gold in this chest is not mine, and yet it is mine to give. It belonged to the Consolidated Blue River Mining Company, whose paymaster I was before I was a teacher. In the autumn of 1889, the company's owner, a man whose name I will not commit to paper, though anyone in this valley will know him, instructed me to short the miners' wages by $1 per week per man and to enter the full sum in the books. I did as I was told for 6 months. I was young. I was afraid. When the mine closed that spring and the men were sent away unpaid of even their honest wages, I resigned my position, and I took with me the sum I had helped to steal from them, $7,240 in coin, the exact difference between what was paid and what was owed. Asterisk. Asterisk I meant to return it. I could not. The men had scattered, to Leadville, to Cripple Creek, to graves I could not find. I built this school with a small part of the money and my own labor, and I taught the children of the men who remained, and I hid the rest behind this wall against the day I might make it right. Asterisk. Asterisk my wife Mary died of the diphtheria in the winter of 1892. My son Thomas followed her in the spring. I have no one left to leave this to, and no strength left to find the men it belongs to. I am ill now, and I do not think I will finish the season. Asterisk. Asterisk whoever you are who reads this, you have found what I could not finish. Take it. Use it well. See, if you can, that the men who worked this valley are paid what they were owed, or their widows, or their children. What is left after that is yours, freely and without shame. Make this place live again, if you can. Ring the bell. Teach the children. Do not let Bell's Hollow die. Asterisk asterisk be kind. Be honest. Be brave. Asterisk. Asterisk Elias Wheeler asterisk. Eliza read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully, put it inside her coat, and sat for a long time in the cold grey light of the hidden room, with 3 bags of gold at her feet and a portrait of a dead woman and a dead child on the wall in front of her. She did not leave Bell's Hollow. She did not take the gold and run. She did not tell Josiah Pell. The next morning she walked down the hill to the postal agent's, and she asked, in a voice as even as sanded oak, if there was anyone in town who had records of the men who had worked the Consolidated Blue River Mine in the years 1889 and 1890. The postal agent, a stout woman named Hetty Bourne, looked at her strangely for a long moment. Then she said that Ansel Crow had been a shift boss at that mine, and Ansel Crow kept his own books, and if anyone in this valley knew where those men had gone, it was him. Eliza walked another mile up the frozen river to Ansel Crow's cabin. She sat at his table and drank his coffee and told him, plainly and without ornament, what she had found. He listened without moving. When she was done, he stood up, went to a small chest in the corner of his cabin, and took out a battered leather notebook. He set it on the table between them and opened it to a page written in a young man's careful hand. It was a payroll roster. 63 names. Beside each name, a number of weeks worked and a sum in dollars unpaid. I kept my own tally, Ansel said. In case the day came. He looked at her across the table. The day has come, has it, girl? The day has come, she said. They spent the winter finding the men. Some were dead. Some were in the poorhouses of Leadville and Denver. Some had widows in Cripple Creek and Aspen, and one as far as Kansas. Eliza wrote the letters herself, in her father's careful hand, and Ansel signed them as witness, and by the thaw of 1907 they had paid out $4,160 in restitution to the miners of the Consolidated Blue River or their surviving kin. The remaining sum, a little over $3,000, Eliza kept, exactly as Elias Wheeler's letter had permitted. She did not spend it on herself. She spent it on Bell's Hollow. She hired the town carpenter, a taciturn Swede named Nils Olsson, to help her rebuild the schoolhouse roof. She did not have to ask. He came up the hill the morning after word spread that she was rehiring, and he refused wages until she insisted, and then he took only what was fair. She bought new shingles, new glass, a new stove, 12 new slates for the 12 old desks. Hetty Bourne began sending a pot of stew up the hill on Tuesdays and Fridays, and would not be paid for it, and only said, when pressed, that her own boy had gone to that school under Mr. Wheeler and had learned to read there, and she owed the building a debt she had never known how to pay. The blacksmith, a broad quiet man named Coombs, forged her a new bell rope hook and a set of iron hinges for the door, and asked in return only to see the hidden room, and stood in it for a long time with his hat in his hands, and said nothing when he left. By the summer of 1907, the schoolhouse had a new roof, new windows, a new well, and a new rope on its bell. On the first Monday in September, Eliza Hart rang that bell for the first time in 12 years. 9 children came up the hill that morning. By November there were 14. Eliza taught them from the same McGuffey readers Elias Wheeler had left on the shelf, and on the chalkboard at the front of the room she wrote, in her own careful hand, the same 3 sentences she had found there on her first day, *, be kind. Be honest. Be brave. *. Josiah Pell learned what had happened in pieces, over the course of that summer, the way a man learns bad news from a ledger. He learned that the Hart girl was paying off old miners. He learned that the money had come from the Consolidated Blue River. He learned, at last, from a widow in Leadville who had received one of Eliza's letters, that the paymaster who had shorted those wages had done so on the direct written order of the mine's owner, a man whose name was Josiah Pell. He did not come up the hill again. He did not need to be confronted. The letters Eliza and Ansel had sent had gone to 63 men and their kin across 4 states, and every one of those letters had named the owner of the mine as the source of the theft. Within a month, Josiah Pell's credit was refused at the bank in Georgetown. Within 3, he had sold the stamp mill ruins and the empty storefronts for whatever he could get. By the following spring he had left Bell's Hollow for a city where his name meant nothing, which was, in the end, the only justice the valley required. Eliza never raised her voice at him. She never had to. Cornelius Hart, in his Denver townhouse, learned of his niece's inheritance only when a small item appeared in the Rocky Mountain News in the autumn of 1907, describing the young schoolmistress of Bell's Hollow who had restored an abandoned mountain school with money found in its walls. He wrote her a letter. It was cordial. It suggested that, as her nearest living relative and the executor of her father's estate, he might be of assistance in managing her affairs. Eliza read the letter once, folded it in thirds, and placed it in the stove. She did not reply. She had already measured him, and she had found him wanting. By the summer of 1908, the schoolhouse in Bell's Hollow had 22 students, a new addition built onto the back for a proper teacher's quarters, and a small library funded from the last of Elias Wheeler's gold. Hetty Bourne's Tuesday stew had become a standing supper at Eliza's table, joined most weeks by Ansel Crow, who at 72 had begun to teach the older boys how to read a trapline and a topographic map, and by Nils Olsson, who had never married and who found in the schoolhouse a kind of family he had not known he lacked. On Friday mornings, before the children arrived, Eliza brewed a pot of coffee on the new stove and drank the first cup standing at the classroom window, watching the light come up over the ridge. It was a small ritual. It steadied her. Numbers always had, and now, so did mornings. She kept 2 objects on the small shelf above her desk. The first was her father's folding brass rule, stamped W. Rabone, Sheffield, scarred and dented from 20 years of use. The second was Elias Wheeler's folding brass rule, stamped Stanley, New Britain, which she had found in the hidden room laid out among his tools. She kept them side by side, hinged open to the same 6 inches on a mild evening in October of 1908, with the aspens on the ridge behind the school turning to hammered gold and the smoke of a dozen chimneys rising from the town below. Eliza Hart stood at that window with a cup of coffee cooling in her hand and looked at the 2 brass rules on the shelf. Her father had given her the first one on her 12th birthday, and had told her that a carpenter without a rule was a carpenter without a conscience. Elias Wheeler had left the second one behind a chalkboard for 11 years, waiting for someone patient enough to measure the room twice and find the 6 feet that did not add up. One man had taught her how to measure. The other had trusted her, sight unseen, to measure honestly. She was 21 years old now. She had been cast out of her uncle's house at 19 with $14 to her name and a deed to a building nobody wanted. She had a schoolhouse full of children, a town that greeted her by name, a stove that did not smoke, and a bell that rang every morning at 8. She thought of her father, and of Elias Wheeler, and of Mary, and of Thomas, and of the 63 miners of the consolidated Blue River, and she raised her cup, once, to the window and to the ridge and to the fading light. Then she went and rang the bell for supper, because Hetty Bourne was coming up the hill with a pot, and Ansel Crow was already at the door, and there was, at last, someone to feed. Thank you, friends, for staying with us through this long story of loss, patience, and the quiet kind of justice that comes not from shouting but from measuring twice. If you were moved by Eliza's journey, by a girl who was handed $14 and a worthless deed and turned them into a schoolhouse, a reckoning, and a home, please give this video a like, and share it with someone in your life who has ever inherited something the world called worthless and quietly made it matter. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you won't miss our next tale. Next week we're traveling south to the Arizona Territory, to the story of a young widow who bought a broken windmill at auction for $3 and discovered why the seller was so eager to sell. Until then, tell us in the comments, what have you carried out of a hard chapter of your life, some small thing you were not supposed to keep, that turned out to be the very thing that saw you through? We read every one. Be well. And remember, wherever you're watching from tonight, measure twice, be honest with what you find, and ring the bell when it is time to ring it. Thanks for watching, until next time.